Preserving democracy is challenging people to share with us how they are ready to vote in 2024. We're also collaborating with the Human Impacts Institute and looking at how democracy and the issue of climate change are intertwined. In this episode of our series, Voices for Change, Democracy and Climate Action, we look at why leadership matters with Jay Hakes, former administrator of the U.S. Energy Information Administration and author of The Presidents and the Planet, Climate Change Science and Politics, From Eisenhower to Bush. Jay Hakes, thanks so much for joining us. The book is called The Presidents and the Planet, Climate Change Science and Politics, From Eisenhower to Bush. Why write this?
I felt like the dots needed to be connected more than anyone had done previously, although there are a lot of good books out there. So I try to connect what the scientists were doing on climate change, really starting in the 1950s, where climate change science gets moving.
Yeah.
Then the political barriers along the way that helped us do something or didn't help us do something. So hoping that if we understood those interplays historically, we could face the future more intelligently.
What was surprising to you about the times we lived in back in the 50s and 60s? And I think a lot of people would be surprised to know that scientists were already warning presidents about this.
Yes, that's a very important point. The period from 1955 to 1960 is a really seminal period that we shouldn't overlook, because Roger Revelle, the great climate scientist from San Diego, he explained that the oceans couldn't be accepting all these greenhouse gases at a rate that would keep them from accumulating in the atmosphere. And then Dave Keeling more or less invented the Keeling curve and found the way to measure carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So all of a sudden, all the misperceptions that we had that climate change wasn't a problem, all of a sudden we knew. And Revelle was very influential. He actually was an advisor to the Kennedy administration. Before my book, I had seen no recognition of that. So we've known about this for a very long time, which then raises the question, why haven't we done more about it?
Yeah, I mean, that is the kind of logical question, especially because in the 50s and 60s, I mean, this was relatively speaking new science. And for decade after decade after decade, we've kind of compounded that science with more evidence, right? So in between, what happened to all those presidents and their decision making?
Well, in the 20th century, our knowledge was based on models. And the models all agreed and predicted pretty much what we're doing today. But somehow the idea got planted in the political circles and even among some of the scientists, well, a model's a model and we need more certainty. Well, we don't demand certainty in the medical policy or in the Clean Air Act or other places. So that was a huge distraction. Now we've entered the new age where we can see the damage in the storms that people were talking about in the 1980s and explaining why hurricanes would be more severe. Well, now we see that and we're paying the higher insurance premiums. So the evidence is even higher, but the jury's still out on whether that level of evidence, which is so clear to me and I think most scientists, will be enough to really move the needle.
You know, you also trace how both parties in power kind of had opportunities squandered, but also took advantage and made some progress.
Yeah, back to your question of what was a big surprise, my biggest surprise was the knowledge in the Kennedy administration. But the second surprise was the bipartisan support for doing something about climate change in the 1980s. And I stumbled on this in President Reagan's second term. We created the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. We dealt with the ozone layer problem, which was related to climate change. And we passed the first high-impact appliance efficiency standards. And the reason that happened, and Reagan had to go along with it, was there was a veto-proof majority in the Senate. And so I try to give recognition to a guy named John Chafee, who was a Republican senator from Rhode Island. And he was actually, in some ways, more specific about climate action than Al Gore was. Al Gore was certainly a leader on the subject. So it looked at that point that we're kind of moving with a bipartisan support. But once the bipartisan support sort of became more fragile, then the filibuster could bring things to a halt. And so we sort of lost our way in the 1980s. And I think only recently, with the Inflation Reduction Act, we've started to get back on track, but we've lost a lot of time in between.
The Inflation Reduction Act is something that people start to think about. Is it something that can help lots of parts of the country, red states as well as blue, and it kind of maybe moves where climate is in the discussion, and it's not as front and center, but people understand jobs and the economy, right? But I wonder, in your research, given that in this book you kind of show us the arc of how presidential politics influences policy and the other way around, can we get back to a bipartisan kind of move forward?
That's the big question. Um, the the thing that I try to focus on, in addition to the politics and the science, is the progression of technology. And sometimes there, when if you do a public poll, you won't find many people are opposed to solar energy, particularly now that it's cheaper than coal. It's hard to find a reason not to like solar power. So back when Jimmy Carter sort of gave the big push to solar, he went out to the Solar Energy Research Institute in Colorado, and the scientists said there, "This is great. The president's supporting what we do. Our work is considered kind of a hippie thing at the time." Well, now we've gone through a lot of science, and over one 40-year period, we reduced the cost of solar energy by 99%. That's not an exaggeration. That's not a typo. It's an MIT study. Costs went down 99% and got more efficient. So if we can get people excited about technology and do the same thing with batteries that we've done with solar, we can bring along some people who may have their doubts about climate change. But it is depressing that after all of this time, that we don't have a bigger coalition behind these measures, because the thing that Revell and Keeling found out back in the 1950s is the carbon dioxide stays in the atmosphere for over 100 years. So if we miss 5 years of doing something about climate change, that carbon and methane are still going to be up there. Methane doesn't last that long, but carbon does. So we can't afford to have the ups and downs. So there is a momentum from the current administration that would probably carry over no matter what the results of the election. But there would be a loss of momentum, and that loss would carry over to the president after that, who might be trying to restart a more activist approach. So again, if we were having this discussion 20 years ago, we could be a little more confident about it, but we can't really afford at this point to be missing too many opportunities, because we're trying to catch up for previous periods of inaction.
Given your understanding of the role of the American presidency in regards to leadership on this issue, where has America's position gone in the last 8 to 10 years? I mean, are we a partner that the rest of the world can rely on? Because it seems like, well, it depends on what happens in this election, whether you guys are going to be serious about climate or even admit that it's a problem or not.
Yeah, first, I'd like to make the point that leadership makes a huge difference. And this month, uh, the United Kingdom is closing down its last coal plant, and they have been very dependent on coal. And none of the news articles that I've seen have given the credit to Margaret Thatcher. Margaret Thatcher was a conservative who strongly believed in the science of climate change. She was trained as a chemist, and she understood science. So leadership makes a difference. So I think people have to look at that way. We have to keep talking about it, and as people go through school and maybe learn it is part of their science curriculum, the base may grow. Now, the other issue that could occur after the election is about the filibuster, and that's a whole other discussion. But it could be related to climate change if there was some majority support in Congress for additional climate action, and the filibuster was blocking that. It is possible to change that rule. So there's a lot of things on the table right now that are hard to predict.
Yeah.
But I don't think any scenario would suggest that the decision ahead of us is not deeply important. Climate change represents a threat to democracy in a way that people might not think about. When scientists first discovered the threat of climate change, they said, well, if the earth changes and soils get dehydrated or coastal land is lost, people can move. Well, they were used to, when the earth changed its climate before, there weren't very many people on the face of the earth, and we're headed to 9 billion. So when land becomes dehydrated, you can get civil wars in places like Sudan. You can get vast migration. And Roger Revelle in the 1980s told the Congress, migration on the southern border is going to depend on what happens to the climate south of us. And I think that has happened. So almost every democracy in the world right now is wrestling with immigration. A lot of people recognize the valuable role that immigrants have played in the country. But there's a lot of people at the border, and so voters are thinking, well, how many can we accept? And what they don't think is, if you want to have less immigration pressure, you have to improve the quality of life in neighboring countries and throughout the world. You have to be concerned about Sudan. You have to be concerned about Central America. And so I actually, there can be tipping points in the science where the climate gets out of control. But there can also be tipping points in the political system if the climate impacts are large enough to dislocate people from where they are and put pressure on them to move at a rapid rate that our political system may have a hard time accommodating.
Yeah, I don't remember how many years ago it was. It was, I think the Department of Defense had put out a report about how climate change was causing national security issues around the planet, that we were going to be in, more hotspots because of global instability.
I was glad they put that out because I started talking about this about 15 years ago. And, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change puts out pretty specific warnings of where agricultural conditions are likely to change.
Yeah.
And so I was we didn't really follow through on it as specifically as we could have, but I thought that you could actually do a predictive model of civil wars based on the climate information. And so that is a whole other form of urgency that you can add to the mix if you're trying to assess the stakes of the decisions ahead.
The book is called The Presidents and the Planet, Climate Change, Science, and Politics from Eisenhower to Bush. Jay Hakes, a U.S. energy expert and author. Thanks so much for joining us.
Pleasure to be here.
In this episode of our series, Voices for Change, Democracy and Climate Action, we look at why youth matter with Sophia Kianni, founder and president of Climate Cardinals. Sophia, thanks so much for joining us. First, tell us a little bit about your organization. What does it do?
Yeah, of course. I am the founder and president of Climate Cardinals. So we work to increase access to climate education, particularly among young people and non-English populations.
What prompted you to do this work, and what's the sort of connection that you see between climate activism, climate action, information, and democracy?
Yeah, 100%. So I was really inspired to do this work because of my Iranian background. So growing up, I would visit Iran over the summers, and I was struck by how horrible air pollution there was. I learned that temperatures in the Middle East were rising more than twice the global average. And despite that, I read a study that basically said less than 5% of Iranian university students could properly explain the greenhouse gas effect. And so there was a very low level of climate literacy in Iran, including among my relatives, despite the fact that they were worst impacted. And I ended up learning that it was because of a lack of resources available in Farsi was one of the reasons. And so it inspired me to begin translating climate resources into Farsi for my relatives, and was the initial inspiration for me starting Climate Cardinals with the goal of ensuring everyone everywhere could access climate education through translating into over 100 languages.
So it was literally that people were kind of being left out of the conversation. It wasn't that the world wasn't talking about climate, it just wasn't filtering down to a population of people who actually need the information.
Exactly. So the statistics are startling. Less than 20% of the world speaks English, and yet over 80 or 90% of scientific literature about climate change is only available in English. So the people who are being worst impacted by these conversations often are left out of them. And that's really what we sought out to solve with Climate Cardinals. And kind of as a byproduct of that, we started to see just how incredibly energized and enthusiastic young people were about working on climate issues, which essentially evolved into now our really signature Youth Fellows program, where we've had over 250 young people come through Climate Cardinals and work on workflows from international relations to communications, all oriented around really increasing access to climate education and climate resources.
So, how does that translate? When someone gets informed about a topic, are they more likely to vote? Are they more likely to become active in their communities?
Education is really the first step to empowering people to take action on climate change. It's hard to get involved in a fight when you don't have the resources. And so with Climate Cardinals, we essentially empower people with the knowledge to better understand how climate change is impacting their local communities. And as a result of that, kind of what they can do, how they can advocate to get involved, and really, like you said, emphasizing that connection between climate change and the need for systemic action. So making people understand the correlation between if you're voting for a candidate who believes in climate change, is going to pass climate legislation, that as an individual, in addition to talking about climate change, is one of the most important, impactful things you can do.
So, a lot of people have a tendency to say, "Ah, God, federal politics is just so removed from me. Climate is such a global concern." How do you see, especially young people, personalize and localize their action when they actually get information, especially if it's in their own language?
Yeah, I think that it really starts with highlighting that the reality is that most of climate change is being caused by fossil fuel companies and fossil fuel emissions, and looking at and stacking my individual emissions or your individual emissions compared to the 100 companies that are responsible for the majority of emissions, you start to understand how we need to use local action as a catalyst to advocate for broader change. And so understanding that, and having our volunteers understand that, really informs that this community-oriented action is viewed through the lens of incentivizing systemic change, whether it be through corporate action, corporate change, or community governance, and then ultimately national governance change.
So how do you inspire young people to connect that dot between their passion for climate change, I guess in the positive direction to try to do something about climate change, uh, versus just feeling maybe disconnected from democracy? How do you connect the dots between getting them informed and then also getting them involved?
Yeah, I mean, I think it really boils down to the incredible work that our youth fellows are doing. So through Climate Cardinals, we've essentially offered hundreds of young people the opportunity to manage teams and budgets, all oriented around either local or national projects. So two examples of that come to mind are we had a volunteer who was like a senior at Berkeley who worked with us over the summer, and she was able to manage a budget to create a website that basically hosts hundreds of volunteer opportunities from around the country, from different climate organizations. So she was able to see that with a small budget and managing a team of volunteers, she was able to create an entire website in just a few months. And then similarly, we had another youth volunteer who was able to generate over 40,000 pre-signups for an ambassador program that she created, that she recruited a team of volunteers to create graphics and to write content for, that has now gone out to tens of thousands of people as part of our newsletter. And so empowering these young people with the resources, with capacity building, with mentorship, and then taking their ideas from 0 to 1. I mean, I think it's really hard to understand something if you can't see it. And so for them to be able to see and witness firsthand the impact that they're able to have when they have the proper resources and mentorship to really foster and facilitate that has allowed young people to understand from an early age this incredible opportunity they have to make an impact. And so Climate Cardinals really just works to foster the incredible enthusiasm and ideas that these young people are already coming in with.
Sophia Kianni, Climate Cardinals, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
In this episode of our series, Voices for Change, Democracy and Climate Action, we look at why stories matter with Mark Hertsgaard, co-founder and executive director of Covering Climate Now. Mark, thanks for joining us. You've said that we need to rethink how we cover climate change as journalists. As somebody who's been doing this yourself for such a long time, what motivated this thought, and why did you start what we're working on today?
I think we as journalists need to remember that even though we're paid by our employers, often not very well, but we're paid, we work for the public. In a democracy, it's our job to alert the public about what the stakes are, what's really going on around them, and why it matters to them. And for too long, most of the media in the United States has either outright ignored or at least underplayed the climate crisis. And that's just in the year 2024 and in the aftermath of Hurricanes Helene and Milton, that's just no longer acceptable. We as journalists have got to do a better job of describing what's going on, and in particular in this election season, helping people understand that they are voting on climate change. It's a climate change election. Of course, they're voting on other issues, inflation, abortion, and so forth, but they're also voting on the kind of climate future that their kids and their grandkids are going to have. And that's for us as journalists to get across. We don't tell people who to vote for, but it's certainly within our remit in a democracy to be telling people, this is one of the things you're voting on. And here's what the different candidates and parties want to do about it. It's up to you what you do with that information.
How do you make sure that that isn't perceived as an activism in itself?
Yeah, that's been a concern I think a lot of our colleagues in newsrooms have had for a long time. But, we don't feel that way when we've been reporting on, say, cigarette smoking. We don't think that talking about cigarettes causing cancer, that's not activism, that's journalism. And likewise, if there are, and there are in this election, the Republican nominee for president, Donald Trump, has famously called climate change a hoax and said that, wind turbines are terrible. Well, that's simply not what science says. And our job as journalists is to reflect the science, to reflect the facts. It's not our responsibility if a political party or a candidate decides that they're going to ignore or deny those facts. That's their political choice, and that's up to them. But our job as brokers of information for the general public is to point out what's true and what's not true, and let the chips fall where they may.
What about in a world now where what you and I consider traditional media is decreasing in its reach versus social media or user-generated content is increasing in its influence and relevance to different generations?
That's a huge challenge, no question. Although I would point out that, and I get into this with my 19-year-old daughter sometimes, that sure, social media is important. I don't think she's ever watched an appointment broadcast news show in her life. She gets all of her news off of the phone. But in this country and around the world, television is still the leading source of news for the largest number of people. Now, of course, it's a big skew demographically, generationally. Basically, it's people over the age of 45 who still watch television. People under the age of 45 increasingly get their news off of social media. But, and that's why we as journalists, I think we have to be operating in all those different platforms. But it's really important to remember that traditional media is much more trustworthy, frankly, than a lot of what you see out on social media, which, you know, as we've seen tragically in the aftermath of Hurricanes Helene and Milton, look at all the deadly disinformation that has been spread there, unfortunately, by former President Trump and his allies, that has led to death threats against TV weathercasters, has led to death threats against the first responders of the FEMA people. So I think that at this moment when, yes, public trust in traditional media is low, how do we regain that trust? We regain that trust by being transparent about what we're reporting and trying to reach people where they are. And I think those are marks of good reporting, no matter what gender.
Connect the dots, if you will, between how climate science is covered and the connection to, I guess, democracy as we head into this election.
You know, in the 2024 election, I would say that both climate change and democracy are on the ballot. And we at Covering Climate Now, we did a press briefing on this a while back where the Congressman Jamie Raskin, the Democrat from Maryland, said, look, you cannot solve the climate crisis if you don't have a functioning democracy. Because if you look around the world, it's autocrats who are driving a lot of the climate crisis in Russia, in China, where the emissions are so high. Whereas in a democracy, the public, the people, in theory, have the power to change the government. And so we have our right. If you're lucky enough to live in a democracy, exercise your rights, vote, speak out. And by doing that, you can control, or at least influence, what the government does. And government policies are so critical to basically tackling the climate crisis and embracing the many solutions that are there. That's one of the things I think, unfortunately, that traditional media too often leaves out, especially in their coverage of climate change. We have the solutions. All the scientists have said this. We have the solutions. We don't need new technologies. What we need are new politicians who will implement those technologies and phase out oil and coal and gas rapidly.
Given that so many issues in America become inherently political and divisive and get caught in kind of a culture war trap, how should or could journalists cover this topic without it being divisive? What are techniques that work which end up bringing people together in even their reading and understanding of this story without it automatically being from a particular partisan lens?
Unfortunately, climate change has gotten caught up in the culture wars in this country. But I think one way for journalists to get around that difficulty is to get off of Twitter and get out from behind your desk and go out and talk to people. And when you go out and talk to people, you find out that roughly 70%, that's 70, of the US public actually wants to know more about climate change. The number of deniers is now very small. It's about 10%. Right? We think there's a lot more because they're loud and they're nasty. And they have a Republican presidential candidate who amplifies that stuff. But most of the public wants to know more about this. And there is still, even in this supposedly polarized country, there is still a lot of support among self-identified Republicans for clean air, clean water, a livable planet for their kids and their grandkids. I think if we as reporters can go out to people knowing that and speaking to that and asking them questions about how they see that happening and what they want politicians to do and informing the public as we report, that the solutions are there and we just need different politicians to implement those solutions. I actually do think that that is a majoritarian message that most of the American people would respond to.
How do we integrate reporting on climate change, climate science? I mean, should we be having beats that like old newspapers used to do that cover this as a topic, or should it be integrated into everything else, just part of the story?
Different newsrooms are wrestling with this question. Do we create a climate desk? Do we have climate reporters all across the newsroom? At Covering Climate Now, we think that there is no one silver bullet, and we trust our fellow journalists. We're organized by journalists for journalists. There's no activists, there's no scientists, there's no government officials. It's just us talking about how we can do this coverage better. And I think everybody knows their own newsroom the best. And they have to decide. Some people have a lot of resources. The New York Times, Washington Post, they have their own climate desks. If you're a public radio station, let's say in Asheville, North Carolina, you don't have, different desks. And that can be an advantage, though, because we also say at Covering Climate Now that the climate story crosses beats. Every beat in the newsroom, there's a climate connection to it, even sports. Whether the climate connection is obvious, politics, obvious, business, pretty obvious, but even sports. Look at the Olympics. In Paris, the Summer Olympics were, let's say, challenged by the very hot weather that they had. But 2 years before that, the Winter Olympics were severely challenged because it was so hot that you couldn't have real snow on the ski slopes for those skiers and snowboarders. So there is a climate connection to virtually every story that we do as reporters. In fact, we say at Covering Climate Now, pretty much all of us are going to be climate reporters in the 21st century. We just don't know it yet.
Mark Hertzgar from Covering Climate Now, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
In this episode of our series, Voices for Change, Democracy and Climate Action, we look at why voting matters with Antonieta Cadiz, Deputy Executive Director for Climate Power in Acción. Antonieta Cadiz, welcome to the program. Thanks for joining us. Tell me a little bit about what your organization does.
Thank you so much for the invitation, Harry. So Climate Power is a strategic communications organization. And basically what we do is we try to tell a powerful story, how climate change is impacting us all, and also how the clean energy transition is benefiting us all.
And who's the target audience that you're speaking to?
I work in particular with a target audience that is Latinos in the United States, but our organization, we try to mobilize people to care about climate actions at all levels. And of course, we work a lot also trying to influence the political climate action in the United States.
Okay, so, one of the misnomers I think a lot of people have is that Latino Americans are some sort of a monolithic voting bloc. How many, if you have this kind of an idea, how many people in America, Latino Americans, are concerned about the climate?
Well, we are not a monolithic vote, and I think we all know that. We come from very different communities and very different backgrounds. Our countries of origin have very different cultures. So, of course, like what resonates for a Venezuelan probably doesn't resonate with a Chilean, for example. So that's one thing. The other thing is that Latinos in the United States, communities of color in general, we live in the front lines of extreme weather. And so you see, for example, extreme heat, 40% of the outdoor workers are Latinos, and they have to deal with the extreme heat every summer. So that put their lives in risk. The same with climate fires. We live in the most exposed areas. The same with flooding. The houses that flood the most are the ones where Latinos, people of color live. And unfortunately, we don't have the same resources to recover as quickly as other groups.
So you have one of the largest voting blocs just by, racial demographic, 18 million registered voters or so. I mean, what percentage do you think are telling you that climate is a concern to them?
Well, in our polling, actually, we identified that more than 70% of Latinos believe that extreme weather driven by climate change is impacting their lives. They
Wow.
are concerned about it, and they want a leader, a president that do something about it. More than 78% of Latinos say that they want a president that actually address the climate crisis and help us transition to a clean energy economy.
So, where do you think it ranks? I mean, because people make decisions about a presidential election or a local politician for a number of different reasons. Well, how does climate fit into the mix of the things that's animating the Latino American vote?
I think that the important thing to understand is that climate is intersectional. Like, we are not talking only about extreme weather. We are talking about your job, for example, because when you're impacted by an extreme weather event, likely you will not be able to work actually the next day or in the next weeks or month after facing an extreme weather event. We are talking about the health of your community. We are talking about your local business. So it's climate is naturally intersectional. And I think it's important for people to understand that it's about our community, about our health, about our children. And I think people are starting to understand that.
What's the message that you get out there to these different communities of color to get them to consider climate as part of that bigger decision?
Well, first is the impact of climate change that we already discussed. But second also is the important story of how this transition to a clean energy economy is actually having a positive impact in their lives. So for example, if we see since the implementation of the Inflation Reduction Act, like the last 2 years, we have created more than 330,000 jobs. That is like half of those jobs are in low-income communities. So this is making a change locally, is boosting local economies. At the same time, is decreasing energy costs. We have worked with a lot of storytellers in key states like Arizona, for example, and Nevada, and we are seeing how Latinos that are actually transitioning to clean energy, to solar energy, for example, are seeing decreases in their electricity bill by $80, for example, or $100. So it's having an immediate impact in their lives, and we want to tell that story and make that more visible.
Does it cross party lines, meaning, or is there still kind of a partisan divide in how people process the importance of climate in their elections?
I think, unfortunately, if you see the two candidates that we have right now, unfortunately, you see like the huge difference and contrast when we talk about climate. You see a candidate, Kamala Harris, that actually accepts the existence of climate change. She wants to do something about it. She understands the benefit of a green energy economy versus Donald Trump, who is a climate denier per se, who is spreading misinformation about climate like every single day, and who basically have meetings with big oil and gas donors and tells them, you know what, you can do whatever you want with the environmental policy of the United States, but please donate to my campaign. So that is a huge, huge difference. And if you think about the 4 years Donald Trump was in power, more than 100 environmental protections were eliminated during his presidency.
What's your message to policymakers about how they need to think about communities of color when they're drafting climate policy?
Well, they need to bring us to the table because basically, and this is what this work is all about, to put the right person in a position of power to make the right decisions for all of us. But they cannot make the right decisions if they don't listen to the communities, to the local communities, to the ones that are dealing with the impact of the climate crisis. So I would say, listen, be open to listen about the impact, and be willing to be bold and do something about it. During the last 4 years, we have seen enormous climate progress. We saw the implementation of the Clean Energy Plan. We saw the pass of the Inflation Reduction Act in Congress. That was huge, huge progress. We need to continue that because we are on the way forward to reducing the emissions that are causing global warming, but we cannot stop now.
Deputy Executive Director of Climate Power en Acción, Antonieta Cadiz, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
Preserving Democracy partnered with the Human Impacts Institute to launch a design campaign that encourages creative expression around democracy and climate action. People from around the world share their designs, including Philadelphia-based designer Rhonda Babb, who was selected by the Human Impacts Institute as the winner of the competition with her Your Vote Matters to Her design. Rhonda Babb, thanks so much for joining us. You participated in the recent competition, Voices for Change, leading up to the 2024 election. Tell us a little bit about your entry and what you were trying to accomplish.
Yeah, I saw the opportunity to create a poster for that, which was talking about, voting and voting for climate. So what I wanted to remind people with my piece was we're voting for Mother Earth, as much as we are for each other and for all of the other issues that are very important. So that's what really I was trying to articulate in that piece, and using the phrase, your vote matters to her. Talking about Mother Earth in particular, was just something I wanted to remind people, that we maybe in our society don't have as much of a connection to nature and the earth as we could or should. So it was just, if of all the other things that we were, that were swirling around with the election and we were talking about, it was just important for me to say to people, let's not forget this other important piece that's affecting all of us, the climate, and the earth and our environment, the air we breathe, the water we drink. All of these things are something that everybody needs to have access to. So it's not really a political issue. It's really more of an issue that is global, and that's what I was trying to articulate.
The planet doesn't really care if you're a Republican or Democrat.
Exactly.
Tell us a little bit about your Hope for Symbol project.
Actually, the Hope Symbol project is, it was a grad school thesis that I did. I went to a Master's of Sustainable Design program here in the Philadelphia area. And when it came time to doing the thesis project, they said, well, you can lean into your background and what you know. And I thought, well, okay, I'm a brand marketer. Let me see if I can develop some kind of symbol or brand or logo around this idea of sustainability and environmental issues. And I started to do some background research and found the story of the peace symbol. And that really resonated with me. That symbol was designed in the 50s as a symbol for the nuclear disarmament movement. And it became this ubiquitous symbol that we all recognize for peace. I thought, well, I could maybe do something that could sit beside that, something for the 21st century. And I was motivated by all the people that I was going to school with. And one motivating factor that everybody shared was their hope for the work that they were doing to make a difference. And that's where the idea of the hope symbol was born. Fast forward, and I started my screen print art practice a couple of years ago. And I thought, well, why not make it the hope symbol project and use the hope symbol as sort of the signature that I use in the artwork that I do, and also sort of the subject matter in a way.
Screen printing. I mean, here we are in an era where people are hurtling towards artificial intelligence and generative AI, and you are telling me that you're a screen printer. Why this kind of very analog expression medium?
It's funny. It became a COVID hobby that I picked up. It was a process that I'd always been interested in. I spent my whole career in front of the computer, as a graphic designer. And I thought, well, I want to do something, with my hands, something creative. I had time So I found an online course actually that allowed me to do screen printing over Zoom, and which I was like very curious about. I'm like, how are we going to figure this out over
Yeah.
Zoom? Had a really wonderful teacher who taught us a lot of the process that you could do at home. And I just really fell in love with the manual nature of it and getting my, it took me back to art school days where I was, getting ink on my fingers and, feeling the paper.
And for those of us unfamiliar with it, if you could kind of help describe what is that screen printing process? What's so physical about it?
Sure, absolutely. So when you're screen printing, basically, it's a very old process. It used to be called silk screening because they used to make silks and put them on frames and then push paint through them. And then through the 50s and 60s, it was used a lot for advertising. So basically, what you do is you have a wood or aluminum frame, and there is a mesh attached to it that is varying levels of porousness. What you do is you block out the areas where you don't want the ink to pass through, and then the areas where the ink does pass through, you place the screen on top of a piece of paper or other material. It can be fabric, could be anything really. And you pull a squeegee. It's basically a long piece of rubber that's attached to a handle.
Yeah.
And you just pull it across that screen and the ink pushes through the screen where you want it to go. And that's basically it. And there's many different ways that you can get the block the screen out. And it's, you basically layer colors on top of each other. So you do one screen, then the next to create an image.
But the unevenness and the unpredictability, I mean, I guess that's part of the art form.
That's right. That's part of the beauty of it, in my opinion. Sometimes there are these inconsistencies that show up, or the misregistration of things, and that gives it that hand, that somebody actually did it. There are machines now that, of course, can
Sure.
pull the screen, but for me, the manual process is something that I really enjoy, and just the process itself of making the screens and sort of the behind the scenes work that people don't see when they see the final print is part of the almost meditation for me of making the art itself.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a way for, as a graphic designer, to get sort of the crisp lettering and typography that I use in my work. Screen printing just seemed to be the way to really make that happen.
So, I mean, what do you hope that people take away from your art when they see it, touch it, maybe experience it?
I really want people to think, right? I'm really not, my work's about climate issues and social justice issues, but I'm not trying to tell people, how to think. I'm telling them, please think. I'm asking them to think, to, look at the world in different ways, to understand that, although some days it doesn't feel like it, we do have agency as individuals to make decisions and choices, and that they should be informed. And a lot of times in my work, I'm asking questions, and they're questions I'm asking myself. Like I'll be reading a news article, or I'll see something, and it'll get my own mind spinning on, what's this about? Why is this the way it is? And that is reflected in my work. And then what I'm hoping the viewer will be attracted to first are the bold colors that I'm using. They'll come up to the image, they'll start looking at the different phrasing or layers of questions or things that are in it, and they'll start thinking about it. And one of the things that I really enjoy is when I'm there, when that's happening, and I can have a conversation with people. I love that experience of being able to talk to people and, just meet them where they are. And those conversations are, I think the art opens up, people to want to talk about things and just engage.
Is there a connection between the medium that you're working in and your concern for the environment and the planet?
In a way, there is. When I'm doing the work that I'm doing with screen printing, I'm trying to use all water-based materials. I'm using recycled cardstock. I'm trying to use the physical process that's not digital. It's very analog. All of that kind of speaks to this, environmental ethos that I'm trying to bring to the work itself. And I think that that's part of it, right? I even make journals out of like prints that I mess up, so that I'm trying to show people that it's not waste. You can take something that some people might consider trash, or they would recycle it or whatever, but you can upcycle it. You can make it into something usable again. So I try to bring all of that into the thinking and process that I'm doing with my work.
Is art a kind of a tool for you to express this, I guess, frustration, not just you, but a lot of people seem to be having at our collective inaction when it comes to climate?
Absolutely. That's definitely where a lot of my work generates from, is, my own feeling. I try to do all the things I can do in my daily life, but in a way that was, yes, a reaction to it. It didn't feel like it was necessarily enough, and I felt like I needed to do something and take my own creativity and talents, and put them out in a way. So that's where yes, the art is definitely my expression of, let's do something. Like,
Yeah.
we're running out of time, with our actions toward, affecting climate change. And so in a way, the art is meant to stand up and say that.
So this competition, this election has come and gone. What's next for you?
So I'm looking at opportunities possibly to do public art practice. I really am interested in engaging in a more, out there way. A lot of the work that I'm doing now, I'm showing galleries, which is great. But I think, I wanted to get out to a wider audience. And then there are other opportunities that are coming forward for me to do workshops. So I can take screen printing techniques and methods into a classroom and work with the public to, first of all, show them how screen printing can be something that they can do, and printmaking in general. It's not a very, it's a very democratic process in a way. You don't need a lot of equipment or materials to do it. And also use that workshop as a way of asking people what their hopes for the future are. What do they want to see? And let them create something that expresses that.
All right, Rhonda Babb, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.